Okay, so thank you for having us. Lana, did you want to start or?
Sure. So, bonjour everyone. Waskaniki Jiko Indigo Jalknoji Nadoda Mapaganista Nadunjaba Kamanista Kwanda Nikana Gana. So my name is Lana Ray. I'm an assistant professor in Indigenous Learning. I'm also an Indigenous Research Chair in Decolonial Futures, as well as the founding director of the Anishinaabe Kandaswin Institute at Lakehead University. And my community is Pwaganistani, also known as Red Rock Indian Band. And so today we're going to be using a recent paper that we published entitled Shapeshifters Systems Thinking to that was published in Social Science and Medicine as a kind of a jumping off point conversation. And after hearing some of the, the very relevant conversations that happened, I certainly want to save some time to talk about our implications in relation to what's already been presented to date. And maybe the last thing I'll add just for this slide, I always try to privilege Anishinaabe artists. So I'll bring back as to why we chose this picture for our presentation. But this is a piece of artwork by Rod Ostamus, who's from Abmatung First Nations. Oh, miigwech.
And so my name is Lloy Wylie. I'm associate professor at Western University in public health. I'm in the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry, and I've been working in Indigenous health for probably 15 years now. Before I came here, I worked for the First Nations Health Authority in British Columbia, where things were moving ahead a lot faster in terms of addressing equity for Indigenous people, particularly First Nations within the healthcare system. And so some of this work started from me moving to Ontario and London and trying to understand the context of what was happening here because things were so much further behind. And so, complexity helps us understand those context things. And then that research instigated a larger research partnership with Lana in Thunder Bay. So we're continuing this work looking at how to transform health systems to better meet the needs of Indigenous people. Okay. Should go forward. There we go. Okay.
So we thought we would just begin sharing a bit about our orientation to complexity. I'm glad we're doing so in some earlier presentations. I heard this was a theme that came up and how people have very diverse pathways in terms of their interactions with complexity theory. So for myself, how I became informed about complexity theory was actually through my partner. So my partner is a number of years ago now was undertaking his master's research. And so he would come home and we'd have conversations at our kitchen table and he'd be sharing about the work that he's doing. And so his work was oriented in complexity theory. And as he was speaking to me about it, it started to sound very familiar. So we'd have these really great and rich conversations about the relationship between Indigenous knowledge systems, specifically Anishinaabe knowledge systems, as well as complexity theory. And so this is something that still remains quite under-theorized. So I was really excited to hear our last presenters have an awareness and really speak about that interrelationship. And was noted in the last presentation, I think it's important to acknowledge that, right, Indigenous knowledge systems far exceed in duration that of the theory of complexity. So while the two, I would argue, are still distinct theories and understandings, there's definitely commonalities between them, and that complexity can really be a language that could help translate or help people understand more so about Indigenous knowledge systems. And Indigenous knowledge systems can very much expand thinking that's currently happening within complexity. So this has already been touched on in the last presentation to some degree, so I won't spend too much time on it. But obviously the idea of being interconnected. So even in my introduction, that's about relationality. That's how, as Anishinaabe people, we do our traditional land acknowledgements. In terms of my introduction to Kanagana, that speaks to that concept if you hear that of all of our relations. So the understanding within Anishinaabe ontology is that the world is fluid. So even when we think about constructs of time and space, those are very much challenged within Anishinaabe knowledge systems. So when we think about our knowledge systems, they're holistic, they're multidimensional, and they're overlapping. And that's practiced and expressed daily in terms of our, especially you'll see that expressed within our forms of spirituality. So one quick example, if you're ever at a ceremony and you see women holding up the water, that water is held up to a certain place because that's understood to be the dimension of where the water is. So although that's something we physically can't see, we acknowledge and we interact with those different dimensions. So that again, that notion of time and space are very much different. So maybe I'll just leave it there for my orientation. I don't know, Lloy, if you want to add a little bit in terms of your orientation.
Sure, yeah, thank you. I didn't mean to click ahead. Yeah, so I had a quite different journey into complexity theory than Lana. So I had quite an interesting journey through academia. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I started off in Latin American studies and really looked at the implications of International Monetary Fund and its debt reduction policies on countries in Latin America and its impact on social policy, and looked at how we often talk about this as a technocratic exercise around debt reduction and deficit reduction, and we're ignoring the huge social consequences of those policies. And then when I did my master's degree, it was European studies, looking at similar things of the coordination of countries to develop the European Union and the common currency. Also had bankers making decisions that I thought were political decisions that had real consequences on the social lives of people throughout Europe. And so I was trying to understand, like, how are we deciding that these are just technocratic exercises where really it's about politics, and we weren't talking about the political issues of that. And then when I started my PhD in political science at UBC, there wasn't a lot of people doing health research in political science. And one of the things I saw as an economist doing this work was we're still spending all of this money in healthcare, and healthcare expenditures always kept going up. Yet people I knew who worked in healthcare and were accessing healthcare kept saying their experiences were becoming increasingly worse in that environment of less resources and austerity within our healthcare system, despite all this money being spent. So to me, as political scientist, I was really told, like, look at what we say in policy and practice and what actually happens in what we do. And it came to confront this so much complexity around those issues. So actually, when I started in political science, I switched over to do interdisciplinary. I did health services research, nursing, and political science as part of my fellowship with the Western Regional Training Center for Health Services Research that was funded by the Canadian Health Services Research Foundation. So that's probably aging me. It was in the early 2000s. And through that work, we actually were introduced to complexity theory, and it really resonated well with me because I was really struggling with seeing that these processes weren't linear, and we couldn't just see a causal link between one thing and the other. There's so many factors at play. And it really helped me understand how I was trying to look at the healthcare system and how we needed to understand what was happening in the economy, what was happening in the social sphere around racism and social exclusion, and the politics around who were making decisions and how all of those were interacting. And yet at the same time, we had to try to provide good healthcare for people. And so understanding all of that context that shapes the way we interact, but yet we still have choices on how we engage with people within those systems. So I found complexity theory really helped us understand what are all the things we need to know about in addressing, the social situation and social order. And so I found it really valuable for the teaching I do. So I teach in public health now, and really it's trying to teach about how do we actually make things happen in the real world. And a lot of times, the stuff that we see in textbooks tries to simplify things as if there's one right answer or one way of doing things. And complexity theory really helped us understand and bring to light a message that I got from my PhD supervisor as there's no such thing as best practices, because there's so many different contexts and what's important for different people and things that we need to consider. that we should really abandon that term entirely of best practices and think of contextually specific responses that meet the needs of who we're working with. And so I found that that's really helped in my teaching to help our students understand how complex the world is. That's probably as well as go forward. Sorry, my computer's not cooperating. Doesn't like my, there we go, okay. Is this my right? Okay, is this, you want me to do this one first, Lana? So one of the things I found really important when I was doing research on access to healthcare services, that we were often problematizing the experience of Indigenous patients or refugee patients as if somehow their culture or tied to their culture was what was creating exclusion within the healthcare system. And so in my work, I really tried to move that focus to those systems and looking at how are those systems excluding people. So it was because of the cultural norms within healthcare that we thought that the dominant norm was just seen as the way we do things rather than understanding it as embedded colonial cultural norms within our institutions. So for me, when I started doing this work, I really focused on what are we doing in our institutions that are making them unwelcoming places and excluding people and marginalizing people within those institutions. And drawing on the literature around cultural safety really brought that home for us of really understanding where does power lie within those institutions, who are making those decisions, and how are they normalizing it. And what we really saw is like we have structural violence within our systems where just the policies and practices and ways we do things are exclusionary and make it so that people don't have equal access to services. And it was really something difficult to get people to understand, because so many people I talked to was like, no, of course we have equal access to healthcare services because it's free in Canada. Anybody can walk through that door into the hospital. And so I found people really had a lot of barriers in understanding how the hospitals were structurally violent places. And I'll just put this out there that, when I first came to London, Ontario, and I was talking about reconciliation and Indigenous health equity in the hospital environment, people were thought I was speaking some bizarro community language that didn't make sense for a hospital, because equity wasn't something we did as a hospital. And things have really changed since then, where people have now acknowledged that, we actually do have to address those issues if we want to provide equitable healthcare. But it's been a real difficult journey for the healthcare system to actually understand how to dismantle those practices of colonialism, because they're so embedded within the system. And so complex adaptive systems really helped us understand healthcare organizations. Oh, my apologies. And what's happening within them. And I really like the last point that in the discussion about leverage points. So as a political scientist, one of the things we always focused on was policy windows. So I don't know if people have heard the concept of policy windows, but the idea was there's certain times when we recognize that our systems have failed and people are looking for new options, and you need to be ready to make that argument of how do we move things forward in that time. And so what I found in my environment here is that 8 years ago, people were like, equity, that's crazy. And then after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports came out, people started coming to me going, oh, I think we have to do something about this. We have to address these issues, but people weren't certain how. And when we think about transformative change, I know research has shown that they want to change like big institutions like hospitals or healthcare. It's like a 17-year process or something like that. And so what I was trying to identify in my work in the hospital is, where are those leverage points and policy windows where we actually can make change? And complexity theory helps us understand that we can have these initiatives in one little zone that then can trigger changes throughout the hospital. And so that's something that I'm trying to work on, is identifying those points we need to start making change in like emergency, where they've definitely become to realize that there's serious problems, that we have an example from emergency room, but also in maternity, that despite the challenges in maternity care, it was one of the institutions within the hospital where it was recognized that patients have families, and that wasn't always the case in the hospital work. So the other thing that complexity theory really helps us focus is on the interrelatedness and interconnectedness of within our institutions, and how all of those actions of people interacting with each other actually has significant impact on various places within those institutions. So it's like ripples on water. A single event can cause waves that radiate in all directions. And I see that happening now in healthcare. But one of the things we need to understand is like, how do we then make sure we create the space for those ripples to have traction, and understanding those complex situations of what's going on and what is motivating people and what are the resources available and what are the policies available and how much supports do we have, all make a big difference in us understanding how do we have the most effective intervention to really make change.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about one concept in particular in complexity. And like Dr. Snyder, myself and Dr. Wylie, we also drew from Sylvia Walby's work. So in complexity, the idea of nested systems exists, but however, when we think about the concept of nested systems, there's still this understanding of hierarchy. And so within Anishinaabe knowledge systems, that interrelationship isn't thought about in a hierarchical way. It's more so like Dr. Wylie described, these circles or ripples perhaps outwards, but not in the same way that it's articulated here. So within Walby's work, she talks about this idea of systems being whole and unsaturated, and so having full ontological depth. So that really resonated. And generally in terms of Anishinaabe knowledge systems, but in particular, it made me think about shapeshifters within our knowledge systems. And so the picture that I had chosen for this presentation, we have many stories and we don't have time to get into this, but being present within our stories that are also our theoretical frameworks. So in one particular story, I'm thinking about Wanabojo and the wolves. Wanabojo and his brother actually turn into wolves. So when they do that, they still have full ontological depth, right? They're whole and saturated. They're still Wanabojo and Wanabojo's brother, but then they take up this other form as well. So these interrelationships that can exist that could cause, for example, the behavior of a healthcare provider to look different within different contexts, that could cause colonialism or settler colonialism to look different within different contexts. And so that was kind of the underlying premise of the paper that we had presented, was that settler colonialism is a shapeshifter. But so are every other type of system. So a hospital can be a shapeshifter, a healthcare provider can also be a shapeshifter. So it essentially goes back to that idea of relationships being interrelated, dynamic, and fluid, which allows for multiple expressions to arise. And so it really is contingent upon this idea that we exist in the relationships that we have. So that's taking it a bit further, I would say, the understanding that we are our relationships. So if we think about this in the context of healthcare and healthcare services, and that dynamic relationship, maybe we think about what are some ways we know systems also could confront each other. So if we think about a healthcare provider who part of that role is to nurture or provide care, but then who also, if you were a settler healthcare provider working in a settler institution, also have a stake in terms of settler colonialism, where you can fit from living off Anishinaabe territory and from your settler government claiming sovereignty over our territories. So how do those two systems then, engage with each other, overlap in a way? So this is where we could get an understanding where an Indigenous person could have a particular experience in the healthcare system, a negative experience, and a non-Indigenous person could have a positive experience. So we often hear that, right? Things like, well, they've always been nice to me. I can't picture them being that way, as an example. Or depending someone's proximity to whiteness, they may be deemed worthy of care or not worthy of care. So other interacting systems like ableism, gender, white supremacy, many others come into play. So I think I will just leave it there in terms of talking about our theory, but it really hinges on understanding more and working within that framework of overlapping systems. And I do agree with Dr. Snyder's critique about lack of attention within Walby's theory of non-human beings. And so I think that's another area too where Indigenous knowledge systems can help inform, because within our understanding of interrelatedness, those include both human as well as non-human beings. So next slide, please. So I think both of us are going to talk about some implications. Maybe just a couple to start with. I think one of the things we're hoping to achieve from this presentation is for there to be an increased analysis that considers settler colonialism. So I know there was a presentation earlier on the pandemic, and there's a lot of literature that talks about how the relationship between pandemics and settler colonialism, and how pandemics and as well as infectious disease in terms of tuberculosis were used as a strategy to organize Indigenous peoples into single family households that were built in a particular way. And now we're seeing in this current pandemic, not having those intergenerational households is having huge implications in terms of lack of childcare, and we see what's happening in a lot of elderly nursing homes as well. Some other implications, I would say the importance of Indigenous research methods were designed in relation from Indigenous knowledge systems. And so even when we're thinking about some of those limitations of how do we interact with non-human beings, or something Dr. Snyder had mentioned in her talk was, we just have limited capabilities in terms of being able to deal with the level of complexity that exists. So within Anishinaabe knowledge systems, through our ceremonies, we have ways that we deal with those complexities, that we actually, speak to the spiritual realm that are much better positioned to provide solutions and help us understand than within our own human capacities. And in terms of thinking of those interrelationships and how we may deal with things like climate change or our relationships with the land. We have those, they're often called cultural protocols, but those are protocols around intergovernmental relationships and different things like that. So I think there's implications in terms of, that's one of the, I'd say one of the critiques I hear about complexity. Well, what are the on the ground then mechanisms to deal with the complexity? What are the methods that we could proceed with? So within, we have some of those quote unquote research methodologies.
Great. Thanks, Lana. So one of the things that I found in my work is that storytelling has been a great way to get complexity and complex issues across in our work. So as I said, I teach in public health, and I was trying to teach about Indigenous health access to care. And one of the things I found was that when we were doing abstract training and online training with health professionals, they really felt lost in terms of how do they actually apply what they've learned to their actual experience in providing care. And so what I did with a group of my students one year was we created a number of vignettes about people's experiences within healthcare and demonstrated the colonial relationships and the way that people are othered within the system and excluded and not really part of their decision making when they're there. And in those stories, we were able to provide the background of like what was happening in that person's life, so that when they came to the hospital, we knew what situation they were dealing with, and also that when we were discharging, we knew what kind of supports were going to be available, because those are some of those complex things that we need to understand. And I found when people had that chance to do role play and be in those situations where they were subject to that colonial attitudes, it really struck with them a lot more than in the past. And I had students say to me, I will never be that doctor because I've never felt so disempowered in my life when I was playing that role of the Indigenous patient in that role play. So I think that the narratives really help us understand complexity. The other thing I just wanted to emphasize too is like I talk about these systems of oppression, so the economic, political, and social systems and how they're constantly interacting. And what complexity theory really helps us understand is it's not linear, it's constantly moving. And the other thing I just want to emphasize is that it's also contested realms, right? So there's like, we have different opinions of what needs to happen in those areas, and it's a constant political struggle to make change. For those of us who are trying to advance equity, we're trying to look at like how can we find those leverage points to make more opportunities for people who are marginalized and get rid of that kind of marginalization that's embedded within our systems. So really thinking about like, not only do we have to understand these structures, but we also have to understand that like people have agency within these structures, and the better equipped they are to understand how those structures work and the barriers that they create, we're better able to actually come up with some solutions. Because I think some of the problems we face in complexity theory, and we're taking on huge issues of colonialism and oppression, is it seems so much to take on, right? And I think what Lana was saying is like, where are the points of action? And so I use that as a teaching tool to look at, okay, if these are the social structures around, say, like racist attitudes about who deserves interpretation services, then we need to address those social issues around challenging people's ideas about racism and who deserves to have care. And then also look at like who's deciding the decision-making systems within our hospitals. So this is something we're struggling with, is trying to have First Nations co-decision-making on healthcare services so that those voices are at the table to change the way that decisions are made in those hierarchical structures. And so we can make those small changes, and certainly at the frontline, care providers can understand the political exclusion, the policies that are structurally violent policies that are exclusionary, and act against those and counteract those in their interactions with patients so that they can provide a positive patient experience for Indigenous patients. So to really think about how we actually can change those relationships within those systems while we're at the same time struggling to overturn those types of systems of oppression.
And maybe just to add on Dr. Wylie's point, follow up on what Dr. Slater had said earlier on in the conference. I also agree with that idea of structural racism really absolving responsibility. So within Indigenous knowledge systems and complexity, that notion that people and systems are both implicated, and that people provide an environment for colonialism, racism, and white supremacy. That idea of responsibility and personal responsibility is really key to our governance structures. And I think that relates to our understanding of the ontology of the way that we construct the world. So there's similarities there when thinking about concepts in complexity regarding proximity and overlap. So yes, there's probably patterns that are likely to emerge, but those aren't set in stone and they aren't definite. So there's always opportunities for an individual to incite change. And just returning to our stories, so within our Wanabojo stories, and again, this picture is an example of one of them, we see that that understanding is present throughout many of our stories too. So I think we've ran out of time, or we're close. So Miigwech, here's our contact information, and we may have 1 minute for.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and happy to take any questions.